There is a secret figure boss fight indoors that the developers don't want you to know about. Or should I say there was, as it was actually scrapped from the game. You see, Figure wasn't always going to behave like the way they currently do, especially in the mines, as what we actually were going to get would make our encounter with Figure not only going to be a lot more difficult, but it would also explain the presence of a very secret Easter egg currently in the game regarding this entity. This scrapped secret figure boss fight is something which has never been revealed to the public before, and it brings insight into how our mind's encounter with the entity was going to play out prior to being changed. So, in this video, we'll be diving into what exactly this scrapped concept was, as well as the chance of some elements of it actually returning to the game in a future update. So, with all of that being said, let's begin. Alright, so as you probably know, the player encounters Figure 3 times in the mines. Around door 14, Figure will drop down from the ceiling below the player, acting merely as a warning that they'll be a threat soon, as during this encounter they can't actually attack you. Around door 20 though, players will be crammed in a small room with Figure, and they must narrowly escape without making a sound in order to progress. Lastly though, around room 80, players will encounter Figure yet again for the last time. Only, this time they'll be placed in a much larger room, and a generator must be powered on in order to escape. Ever since Floor 2 released, players have been familiar with these 3 Figure encounters. They have become somewhat iconic in a way. However, as I had stated, this wasn't the original plan for the entity, as they were actually going to be portrayed differently in the mines. In fact, it was actually going to be a lot more difficult. So difficult, in fact, that the developers had to completely scrap their initial idea in favor of what we got currently. Let me paint a picture for you. As you walk into the next door of the mines, you are faced with a giant room featuring a massive pit in its center, a giant quarry of sorts. In said quarry, you'd find Figure roaming around, listening for any players it could potentially attack. However, alongside Figure in that same pit would also be a generator which needed to be powered on in order to escape into the next room. Yeah, in this version of the Mines boss fight, you'd need to be very close to Figure in order to activate the generator. And despite seeming rather simple based on that rough description, it's actually a lot more complicated than what I'm letting it on to be. Now, you might be thinking, Cheddar, there's already a generator puzzle room with Figure in it. How is this any different? Well, the key feature of this version of the Figure room is the proximity of Figure to the generator, as well as what occurs after the generator is completed. In the current Figure generator puzzle room, the generator itself is hidden away in an area accessible by Figure, whereas in this scrapped boss fight, Figure can freely get right up and close to it. Something pretty horrifying even would happen once the generator is actually turned on. Upon activating the generator, the noise it produces would immediately attract Figure, so the entity will just book it to the generator, which is where the players would be physically located when it is activated. This means that after turning on the generator, players would have to run out of the way, or else Figure would run it right into them. A feature which goes against everything the player had been taught about the entity up until that point, as players typically always crouch slowly around the entity, they don't run. This mechanic added a really interesting gameplay element to the Figure boss fight, which unfortunately isn't present in its current iteration. However, this ability isn't actually completely lost. As you may know, if you use the admin panel to spawn Figure into a room with a generator and then turn on that generator, Figure will actually run over to the generator and smash it. This is actually a remnant from the scrapped Figure boss fight, and that explains why the Easter egg is a little buggy, as it's technically unfinished. Now, based on what I've said, it appears that this version of the Figure Mines boss fight is a lot better than the current iteration, so why did it change? Well, due to the layout of the quarry room, as well as the position of Figure in the generator, actually completing the room would be impossibly difficult. Figure could just walk into players trying to activate the generator, and based on the developer's description of the room, it appears that the pit itself, where all this takes place, would be relatively cramped, so it would have been unnecessarily difficult for just a minor encounter with the entity. They also described it just not being fun, which is something I understand. Now, at this point, it seems that that's all the information we have about this secret version of the Mines Figure boss fight. However, that is not the end of our story. You see, Figure has always been one of the backseat players in the mines, as their encounters are generally just mild nuisances rather than actually major events like how they are in the hotel. I did find this quite disappointing, as although I definitely understand why the spotlight would remain on Seek and the Grumbles on this floor, I feel it would be pretty cool if Figure also got more attention instead of just being a mild appearance every here and then. If you recall, a while back I made a video going over a concept for what I think would be a very cool way to re-implement Figure into the mines by expanding their appearances. And although I still think that's a decent suggestion, I feel we can tweak it to make it more in line with how the current Figure boss fight plays out by adding elements from both the current and scrapped versions of their mines encounters. Now, given how Floor 2 does take place in a mineshaft, I definitely do think the idea of quarry or dig site rooms is not only fascinating but very well fitting for the floor. However, they should probably be expanded to be able to comfortably fit both Figure and a generator without causing any unneeded difficulty. In fact, the generator could actually be hidden in a player-accessible only room, much like how it is currently in the mines, and that way the issue is completely not present at all. I also think it would be very cool if these modified quarry rooms would appear multiple times throughout the mines, and maybe alongside or even in place of the current Figure room layouts, so that way there's a plentiful amount of different encounters with the entity. And given how it's likely not all of these hypothetical room layouts would appear in one run, each mines playthrough would be different as each Figure encounter would be unique. However, in order to spice up this hypothetical mines Figure expansion even more, I think it'd be very fitting for the Grumbles to be present alongside it. These entities are a major part of the mines, and although the Queen gets a fair bit of screen time, the normal Grumbles only appear in the nest and then never again. So I think in some of these Figure puzzle rooms, a Grumble or two could appear as an additional threat players would have to avoid, such as like under a pit or something like that. This would not only make the normal Grumbles have a bigger presence, which is something I think a lot of people would appreciate, but it would also be very cool to see how they and Figure interact with each other, as both are some of the most well-known characters in the entire game, and despite that they've never been seen in the same room as one another. Now, of course, the developers have said multiple times that Figure would be receiving a much larger role in Floor 3, but I don't think anyone would be opposed to them receiving a little more attention in the mines, and maybe incorporating elements from the secret scrapped boss fight with this entity would be a good way to execute that. So, to summarize, Figure's encounters in the mines were originally going to play out a lot different than how they do currently, with the old version being so difficult that they in fact completely scrapped it in favor of the new one. However, as I had said, I think if elements from that old version, such as the concepts of dig site or quarry rooms, were added alongside the current Figure encounters, as well as some other cool features like Grumbles to spice things up, Figure could become quite an interesting threat in the mines, even though they are meant to take a backseat from the game's story in this floor. I also, recording this video, just realized that in these dig site or quarry rooms, there could be like fossils of prehistoric entities or something like that, which could give insight to the lore. I don't know, I just thought that was a cool idea. Still, with all of that being said, I doubt the developers would touch Figure in the mines, as their encounters do play out fine currently. They're pretty much just good. But improving them is something I don't think anyone would be against. Anyways, with all of that being said, let me know in the comments what you think of this scrapped Figure boss fight, and thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.